my pleasure to introduce you to the last panel of Time of the Writer, Writing Gender Violence with two of South Africa's own writers, Kagiso Molope and Shafinaaz Hassim, facilitated by Shubnum Khan. Thank you.
So, good evening, Durban. It's great to see all of you out tonight. I've been always telling the other writers that people in Durban don't really go out at night, so it's great to see you people here. Tonight we're talking about gender violence, and as one of the panelists told me, Saturday night for gender violence is pretty heavy. But I guess possibly Saturday night is the most apt night to be talking about it. So gender violence has been in the spotlight with obviously the Delhi gang rape and with the rape of Van Boysen and possibly even the violence against Riva Steenkamp. Now I personally feel like this kind of violence, gender violence, the power from this kind of violence comes from it being sort of taboo in society to talk about. There's a secrecy to it and it's shrouded in shame. And so I feel these kind of discussions and these kind of books that you guys write open up discussions with the public and an engagement to discuss the topic so that it's not something that people would feel ashamed to talk about, and it's not something that just remains in the confinement of a bedroom. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two writers tonight. Shafinaaz Hassim is from Joburg, but she calls Durban her second home. She completed a Master's of Arts and Social Science at the University of Witwatersrand. She lectured in undergrad and postgraduate courses at this university in post-structuralist feminism. And her first book was Daughters Are Diamonds, Honor, Shame and Seclusion, A South African Perspective. Her second book was launched at the Cape Town Book Fair, which was a memoir for members for Kenya. And she edited Belly of Fire, an anthology of short stories. And her third novel is a book on domestic violence. And then we have Kagiso Molope, who is a graduate in English literature and literary theory in the University of Cape Town. And her first novel, Dancing in the Dust, was shortlisted for the IBBY International Board on Books for Young People list for 2006. Her second book was The Mending Season, set in South Africa in the early 1990s. And her third book, which was launched on Wednesday, this book, Betrays My Brother, which I just finished this week, which was great. And yeah, she's a Human Rights Project officer based in Canada. She's been involved in human rights advocacy, counseling, and documentary filmmaking, which we're going to talk a little bit about later on. So I'd like to open a little bit with you guys reading a little bit from your work, just to give the audience an idea of your kind of writing, and then maybe we can just get into the topic of gender violence. So Shafinaaz, you can go first.
I've actually chosen to read the opening scene to get directly into this whole notion of writing gender violence as per the topic. But I'll also give us a small sense of, Sophia has written about a couple experiencing violence and then their children involved in the relationship. So I'll read a piece about Samir, a 6-year-old boy, and how he configures this notion of violence as he's experiencing it. So just the opening chapter quickly, the opening act rather. Zareen thought that her eyeballs might pop out of their sockets if he squeezed his hand any tighter around her throat. There was no time to escape, not even in her mind. She banged her palms against his chest, fighting to escape, while her lungs struggled for air. Her legs dangled as if detached from her body. The walls of her bedroom whirled around her, witness to her humiliation, her doom. His angry muttering hadn't stopped. Good for nothing, this will teach you to speak back to me. Akram's abuse was the same as ever. All that mattered to her was that she couldn't feel her legs, that her eyes threatened to leave her body. Perhaps they'd seen enough. Her chest heaved, once, twice, as if sending an arm out to grab for air. Akram, stop it, she tried to scream. A suffocated gurgle burst out of her throat instead. Panic jolted her body. She dug her fingernails into his face. Still raging, he staggered back. You stupid bitch! She stepped away from him, feeling the brushed carpet turn to cold tiles beneath her feet, and slammed the bathroom door shut, locking out his angry face. Zareen, open the door! I'm warning you, woman. His screams got louder, punctuated by his fists banging on the door. She shut her eyes for a moment, hoping this would help to fade the din, and then she opened them again to take in her reflection. The image she saw in the bathroom mirror was still clutching her throat, gulping air, gathering a stream of water in a set of eyes that seemed horrified still to be in their place. The bruises on her neck and face turned red and blue and purple, a comic canvas. This was her trophy for not seeing to it that his suits were hung in order of make and wool type, or something like that. That was today. It was always something else. His methods were unpredictable. Anger did that. It made one irrational. Sometimes he used his hands. Sometimes the sight of her tears seemed to satisfy him. He'd stop. He'd walk away. At other times he used his belt. If she screamed, it excited him. The intensity of his anger was unpredictable. She could never really tell how he would react because she never knew what spurred him on. She would replay the incident over and over in her mind. Next time she would not provoke him. Next time she would make certain that his shirt hangers faced in the same direction. And the kids, next time she would make sure that they played more quietly and be asleep earlier. And she would prepare the food better, and she would make a better cup of tea. The list went on, but she knew that her marriage depended on it, and so she did what she had to do. And quickly a sense of Samir. Samir is out with his 9-year-old sister and his aunt, buying a loaf of bread. Naji, just get 1 loaf of white bread and some hot dog rolls and 2 liters of full cream milk, Mariam told her niece. Samir, we can fuel the car while we're waiting for Naji. She needed to let him know that he had something important to do. If she let them go into the store together, there'd definitely be an argument about something. Samir nodded at his aunt from the back seat and looked down at the Nintendo in his hands. Do you want something from inside? She asked, and looked up to see that Naji had already gone ahead. He didn't reply at first. I don't want my daddy, he whispered. The 6-year-old bundled on the back seat of the car looked up at his aunt. Oh, you don't mean that, Sam? Mariam struggled to keep her voice light. It's because they keep on fighting, he said. Mariam's eyes looked at the forgotten game console in his hands and then back to her nephew's face. I don't want my daddy. He bullies my mummy, you know, Carla, and he holds her like this. His tiny hands grasped his throat for a few seconds. And then like this, he moved his hands to firmly grasp his mouth shut. That's what he did, and we were crying. I was scared for mummy. He watched her. How long had he wanted to share something like this? Mariam's heart pounded against the inner wall of her chest, as though it had been locked in there by mistake. She fidgeted with the beaded choker around her neck. Can we get some ice cream now? The Oreos one from McDonald's, he said. Yes, sure we can, Mariam turned to face the front. She knew what Zareen's life was about, but she had only vaguely thought about the impact on the children, choosing to believe that they were still too young to understand it all. You know, Naji likes the fudgy one, he giggled, but that's too messy for me. She turned to face him again and smiled. She ran her eyes over his perfect baby skin, his large inquiring eyes. The Nintendo beeped to life once again, shrieking in delight at Samir's renewed interest in its games. He was still a baby, a child who didn't want his father, a little boy who wanted to protect his mother from his father.
Wow. Kagiso, do you want to go next?
Sure. I have to apologize to people who were at the launch. I just decided to read at the last minute, and so I'm going to read the same passage. Naledi, the narrator, has a good friend whose name is Ole, and they've been playing games since they were very small girls, and they have this game they play called Tell Me Your Deepest, Darkest Secret, and that they used to play when they were very little, but right now they're teenagers, and they haven't played it in a very long time. And at this point in the novel, Ole has just brought up the game after years and years of not having spoken to each other like this. At this point, the big incident in the book has happened, and Naledi's just kind of trying to move past it or trying to deal with it without really talking to anyone about it. So, of course, that Friday in my room, I knew what Ole was on about. I suspected she already knew my deepest, darkest secret. She leaned against the wall beside the window and let her hand hang out, another freshly lit cigarette between her fingers. She stared straight ahead, and I was grateful she was not still glaring at me. I went to put a CD in the CD player. Tony Braxton's low voice emerged like a slow, seductive moan, matching the softening light of the late afternoon. Ole said, "Okay, tell me something else then." I put on a pair of white shoes with very small heels, the highest Mama would let me wear. I looked at the shoes in the mirror, trying to decide if they went well with a black skirt that I had just pulled on under a blue dress. Ole took her time. "Tell me why you think your brother has stopped speaking to me, Bonnie," she eventually said. I sank into a chair and looked at Ole's back. Her pants... Oops, I'm sorry. Sorry. I skipped ahead. "I didn't know. You were in the car on Monday. Tell me why you think he did that. Twice now I've seen him leave her house in a rush." Now it made sense why Ole why Basi had been so late to the shop and why he and Papa had a fight. He must have had an inkling that Miponi was not going to be quiet about what had happened. "I don't know." Ole remained calm and didn't turn to look at me. "You don't know," she said, like she was carefully calculating my next move. Then she took a long puff of a cigarette. "Nope," I blurted, a pitiful attempt at sounding nonchalant. This time, she did look at me, even if it was only her head that turned. Feeling my hands shake, I pressed them to my lower back and continued. "Maybe it's about the dance. I don't know. Maybe they had a fight. Who knows? Who knows what happens between two people? They say, taba ke tsa babedi. We, you and I, can't really know, can we?" I had put on and taken off 3 different pairs of shoes by the time I stopped talking. Now I tried to take in deep breaths through my nose. Ole stood in the same position, looking slightly stunned with her mouth open and the cigarette burning away between her fingers. Her eyes went up and down from my face to my now bare feet, as if she was deciding how to meet my challenge. She must have known that I had every intention of acting obtuse. "Eish!" she exclaimed, suddenly flicking the butt, which had started to burn all the way to her fingers. She sucked them and looked me in the eye. "You know what I think? I think we can know. I think sometimes tabakitsababedi. That's true, but not always. I think that when one of the two people tells you something happened, and you know that something is wrong, especially," she was now moving closer to me, "especially if the person telling you is a girl who says a guy did something awful to her, and that something is illegal." She paused, letting me take in the word. "Then I'd have to say that's when Ditaba stops being Zababedi." She sucked in some air through her teeth and kept her eyes on me. My heart felt like it would burst through my chest, like I was drowning. I could see the water now, clear above me, blurring the ceiling and softening the light above. Ole came very close to me, close enough to put both hands on my shoulders, so close that I inhaled a cigarette breath when she spoke. "Do you know what I'm saying? Do you know what I'm talking about?" I hesitated too long, and time seemed to come to a standstill as the two of us locked eyes, each waiting for the other to speak. Finally, I looked down at my bare feet. Ole made a sharp turn toward the window again, where she stood with her back to me. "Do you know what a guy once told me?" I didn't answer. "One day," she said, "I was just walking to the shop. It was a really nice, warm day, and I was excited about going to a Boxing Day picnic. I was going to the shop, your shop, to buy more bread and cool drinks." She shook her head. "So I was just walking along happily when one of the guys, you know, the ones who sit there on the shop stoop all day doing nothing, well, he said something for everyone to hear. And it was a bit of a surprise because normally those guys don't whistle at me like they do with the other girls. And this time, there was no one I knew sitting there. So one of them said, 'Eish, this one just needs to be raped. That will fix her.' We both took in the silence in the room as Tony finished the song. I nearly ran, but I didn't. I told myself, don't show them you're scared. That's when they'll come after you. I sank into a chair and looked at Ole's back. Her pants were baggy the way she liked them. Her shoes and shirt were men's, and so was her hat. It wasn't a stretch at all for me to picture what she was saying. I could see it. I could see the group of boys sitting in the entrance to the shop, calling out to girls, every girl who walked by, saying, 'Eish, baby, I like your butt,' or 'Come to my house and let someone touch those Dikola Molora for a while.' Dikola Molora is Tswana for small, budding breasts. And if they got a glare instead of a smile, 'Eish, you're actually really ugly, and I was just calling you to make you feel better.' Or even worse, come on, next week you'll be begging me to touch you. Cease. So yes, I could picture Ole walking by and hearing that. But I kept thinking, my brother is not one of those guys. As I watched her standing there, still as a stick, I realized for a moment, and perhaps for the very first time, how terrifying it must be to be her, walking around Kasi every day. I couldn't imagine being her, with the knowledge of unidentified dead bodies and Vera the ghost, and hearing people's contempt for her spoken out loud. And it was really shameful, I suddenly felt, that having been such close friends for most of our lives, I was only now thinking about it.
Thank you, Kagiso. I'm always fascinated to know why writers write about what they write and how they choose their topics. I write about women, as you know, and I realized in retrospect that I was writing about women because I had 3 older sisters. My mother has 6 older sisters, and I wanted to tell their stories. And I mean, I only realized this in retrospect. But it always interests me to know, why do you choose the topics that you do? So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about why you started writing about this. I mean, both your last books have been about gender violence. How did you get into this? Shafinaaz, you can go first.
Well, with mine, obviously, you know, there's an interest in story and narrative and the kind of data that presents itself. But as a trained sociologist, my primary work has been in documenting issues concerning women in various ways, especially with Daughters Are Diamonds and the kind of debate that came off the causes I developed around that book on feminism, on women negotiating the space within a democratic space, but also the idea that within a traditional space, women cross a threshold and then all autonomous decision-making is stripped away from them in many cases, and what it means to carry various labels as a woman. And throughout those kinds of topics, throughout writing about women in those spaces, I knew that the story of violence was a compelling and necessary, actually, that it demanded being written. And I started writing abuse, the story of abuse, about 4 years ago. And Sophia was born. We've just launched it 2 months ago. But really, you know, these stories can be spoken about at you know, sort of scientifically unpacked. And how much of a shift are you really going to create in consciousness unless these stories start to be spoken about, read in a context where it can be engaged on a larger scale, with a larger readership. And this is the reason for actually writing fiction for what is the first time in my case.
Well, I grew up in a very violent place, and I witnessed people getting attacked all the time. And so I was always very aware of how vulnerable I felt and how difficult it was to be living in that place at that time. But at the same time, I was watching a lot of violence from behind a large, often locked gate. And I was sort of in the place, but I was also separated from a lot of the violence. And I remember, you know, it would be Sunday afternoon and after lunch, and people would be kind of hanging out and drinking and, you know, listening to good music or whatever. And suddenly there would be, you know, this great noise outside, and everybody would rush to the street and watch what was happening. And often, a lot of those times, it was a woman being beaten. And sort of everybody was kind of coming out to watch and see what would happen. And people would laugh and they would clap and they'd be horrified, and then they'd go back to their homes. But I always wanted to write about the role of the witness in times like that. And that's why the book is about, the narrator is a witness of violence. And so I've always kind of wanted to explore what the witness's role is, what you do. Do you go out and speak out? Do you laugh at the scene and then just walk back to your home and say, boys will be boys, men will be men, you know, that sort of thing? Or do you actually speak out? So I wrote this book just to kind of look at that. Yeah.
I think I'm going to expand a bit on that in this next question. Now, I finished both your books recently, and so I had time to compare them, and I was surprised at how similar they both were, because they dealt with different communities and different kind of relationships. We have in Shafinaaz, in your book, a married couple, and then a couple going out in your book, Kagiso. But, so it surprised me at first that there were similarities. I mean, well, I didn't think that there would be. But I realized that abuse and domestic abuse even will obviously have universal similarities in them, and they follow patterns and cycles. And there was something that bothered me when I read it, and maybe you guys can just comment on it or maybe explain it to me, is that these victims go through these very traumatic experiences of abuse. And, well, obviously they have to speak out about it, and that obviously takes a lot of courage as well. But I'm interested in knowing why then, that they've been through this and they're victims themselves, why then are they further victimized? And Kagiso, you've mentioned just now that these men would come outside and laugh at them, or, you know, it would be like a big spectacle. And Shafinaaz, in your book, and this might be a bit of a spoiler, but sorry, Zareen's husband walks out on her, and the family are all they blame Zareen, basically. They say, oh, well, she used all his money, and she wasted his money, and that's why he left her. And it couldn't have been him because he's an upstanding man, a citizen, upstanding citizen in the community. And in your book, Kagiso, Moipon is just looked down upon as this girl who tried to get our hero of our community, and he can't do anything wrong. I mean, he's the first boy in the family anyway, so he could never do anything wrong. And so there's this tendency, I feel, to blame the victim, and generally the victim is the woman. And I'm trying to understand this because this is a cycle, and I see this happening all the time. And maybe you could perhaps comment on it. Kagiso, you've done counseling, and Shafinaaz, you have your sociology background. Just perhaps to comment on why then is the victim further victimized, and why is it so, and why do we blame the woman all the time?
I think we have to look at the discourse around violence, and specifically gender-based violence. And I'm thinking of, you know, especially with the piece that Kagiso read now, and in so much of the data you get this notion of, I mean, is it acceptable for society to, you know, for somebody to go around saying, well, she needs to be raped in order to be fixed, you know, how do we speak in society without a sort of consciousness and awareness of how wrong it is if you're perpetuating violence against someone, if you're actually oppressing someone in whatever situation. So victim blaming draws from a strong sense of denialism. I'm always struck by an immense sense of trauma, immense trauma that operates throughout society. And there's this kind of trauma flinging that goes on. So we transfer trauma through our discourse, through our practices, through the way that we speak, through the language that we use, through blaming the victim, through insisting that she must have done something to deserve this. It doesn't just happen. And there's a strong sense of denialism. So violence and abuse happens somewhere out there, and somebody caused it to happen to themselves. She must have done something to deserve it. She had to be punished, disciplined, or fixed. And so she was hurt, mutilated, or raped, because somebody out there is taking it upon themselves as a sort of pseudo self-righteousness to fix, to correct. We talk of also so-called corrective rape. The idea that lesbian women need to be fixed is a very problematic and pseudo self-righteous assumption taken on in a very patriarchal sort of in a very patriarchal context. So all of this needs to come back to understanding where where the discourse begins, what it means, how problematic it is, and how it actually needs to be adjusted. It's not correct to say, she needs to be raped in order to be fixed. It's not correct to say that the victim must have done something to deserve this. And the self-victimization is even more explicit when she says, next time I'll do something better. What did I do to deserve this? Next time I'll make the tea better, I'll hang his shirts better, I'll make sure the kids are quiet. We're transferring trauma almost on a mudslinging kind of dimension. And I'm immensely struck by this notion.
Well, in this particular community, in this book, Basi is this upstanding young man, and it's not a community of, it's a very oppressed community, and it's not a group of people who see a lot of young men like him sort of be very, very promising. And I think, and let me just continue. So what happens is that then he becomes a representative of them. And so if you say anything against him, you're saying anything against them, because they see him as someone who's sort of bringing up the community. So when Mwiponi accuses him of rape, she's then pushed outside, and part of the problem that Naledi has is feeling that if she says something, then she'll also kind of be pushed outside of the community, because she's not following the plan. She's not getting on board. She's not part of the plan to have the community be brought up. So it's not a betrayal just of him, it's a betrayal of them. And so you can see his buddies are all just kind of, not our boy, other people have nothing to say about it. He's ours, he belongs to us, and she has nothing to say. She's an outsider who's trying to bring the whole community down. So I think that's what happens here. I can't speak for many other places, but this is. Yeah.
But I mean, there's a strong thread also of, when you talk about victim blaming, this strong consciousness of being victimized, the potential to be stigmatized and victimized, also silences the victim. And the perpetrator is very well aware of that, and presents themselves then as this perfect, upstanding, charming individual who has it all together, and everything's fine, everything works out fine. And the victim really feels the sense of, I've got to keep it together, or who's going to believe me? We have numerous cases of, this notion of rape in marriage, and obviously we'll chat about this, and the idea that it's problematic to assume by virtue of the marriage contract, and this is the an inherent problem in the notion of, by virtue of the marriage contract, that sexual intercourse is consensual, and so what does rape not occur or cannot occur within the scope of a marriage? But even then, I mean, do you actually need the contract in order to configure how this relationship is construed? No means no. How do we break down these assumptions and these issues based on contractual kind of understanding and the politics around consent, especially?
And you just put that question out there, which is a question I was going to pose to you, or to both of you, is that in both your stories, the characters are involved with their abuses. And so, in your book, Kagiso, it's, society says, well, if it did happen, if it did happen, we don't believe it happened, but if it did happen, she was his girlfriend, so what did she expect? I mean, that's what you do, so it's not his fault, again, this victimization thing. But so I'm interested in knowing then how then do we begin, and this is a broad question, but how do we begin sort of changing those perceptions that if you're in a relationship, it doesn't mean that everything that happens in the confines of the relationship is consensual, because it's not. And it's just that general understanding out there that, if they're married, in your case, Shafinaaz, or if they're going out, then it's all consensual. It's not actually abuse. It's not really abuse. It's not really rape. How then do we begin opening up conversation about this, or how do we start discussing this?
Wow.
I know it's a broad question, but maybe just what are the steps do we take then? And you have touched on it a little in your last answer, Shafinaaz.
I'll give Kagiso a moment.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I think as with the whole issue of sexual assault, when you talk about it anyway, I think even outside of a relationship or marriage, I think we very much have very strong rules about what happens when a man is with a woman or a woman is with a woman, or a man is with a man. I think we kind of have this idea that we we leave it up to you. What happens is private. What happens doesn't need to come out. But I think that we need to kind of open up spaces, perhaps, for people to speak more freely about it. There needs to be some kind of support about it, I think. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that formalized support structures do exist, but it's a bit more complicated than actually reaching out for formal support. And I constantly say that, there's support structures that exist even within the family and within the community, and it comes down to personal and communal responsibility. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because a woman feels, who's going to believe me if I say that my husband raped me? And she says that when it happens. She's like, is that even a thing? She feels violated, but who does she say? It's a case of being stigmatized and somebody again pointing to a weakness in her and saying, well, there's something you're doing wrong. There's something you're doing wrong and you deserve this punishment. And so this feeds into itself in a kind of cycle, in a self-perpetuating cycle in a way. So when it comes back to then reaching out and speaking to someone, she seeks support, some kind of counsel in her sister, but insists upon her sister kind of silence, the same silence that she's subjected to. And so she, in her own way, is spinning this cocoon of silence in a way, seemingly protecting her situation, but just perpetuating her own oppression. And so the structures do exist, whether informally or formally. But how do we actually break down the victim not further victimizing themselves in a way? And these are the complexities that counselors face and community counseling activists face every day. So
I think the fact that we're talking about it more helps.
Yeah. What's interesting, I mean, you mentioned briefly, now we've dealt with, we've looked at the case, even though there have been thousands of cases in between, of Anane Boysons and Jyoti Singh and Riva Steenkamp. But what's powerful about the way civil society has come together and said, not in my name, this is not how it should be. I don't want my daughter to be part of the statistic. I don't want my sister, I don't want to be part of the statistic. I think that there definitely is a renewed consciousness. I think there's something very powerful about the way we are engaging on the topics, on this panel and on various panels. And even though one or two have been highlighted, we know the statistics. And, you start to look in the mirror and say, this is who we are. We're doing this. We're part of this continual cycle of violence. We're a violent society. We're a traumatized, violent society. And something's got to give. This is where we turn this around. This is where this has got to change. And it changes where we've got to turn around how we speak about various issues, how we construe gender, and how we construe a sense of, humanity. Speak with awareness, speak with social consciousness. Know that your words actually have an impact on how girl and boy children relate to each other.
I think an interesting point is there that our communications have changed, our way of communications. And I think a lot of, like before, if you were angry and upset about these things happening, then you would write a letter to the editor. But now you have social media and you can express yourself more. So I think that opens up a lot more conversation. Now that we have platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so on. Kagiso, you've said that you do documentary filmmaking. Well, you were involved in it. And you went into the townships and you said you were interviewing women and asking them about abuse. Maybe you could tell a little more about it to us?
I always kind of cringe when I see that I'm a documentary filmmaker. I just went to a friend's house and took a camera and we kind of walked around the township in the hot sun and told ourselves that we were filmmakers and we were awesome.
Awesome.
And I went around the township I grew up in, just talking to women about how they felt, whether or not they felt safe where they lived, having experienced a lot of violence or witnessed a lot of violence during apartheid, I wanted to know if that community was feeling that it was continuing or if it had calmed down, if things had changed at all. And what I was getting from all the women, not a lot of the women, all the women, was that they just felt like they were under siege, that there was a war going on against them, and every single one of them had been assaulted in some way or had watched their child be assaulted in some way. And I just sort of was going around recording these stories and kind of keeping them for, I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Maybe I just was going to show them, or I was going to use them for a book. But at the time, the most important thing was communicating and giving them a space to talk about it, and wanting them to feel that they had a voice and they had something to say, and that the stories were heard and they were important. So yeah, okay. It was like VHS, like forever ago, but yeah.
I think that's really awesome though. I'm gonna have one more question, I think, because I'm gonna open up questions to the audience as well. Shafinaaz, I'm really interested in knowing what was the reaction of your community to your novel. Certain communities talk about this openly, some are in denial, I think, a lot of it is shrouded in a lot of secrecy. And I mean, was the book welcomed? Did you get criticisms? I'm really interested in knowing how that went.
I think that obviously when a book is out, first put out, you're not certain what the response will be, and it's what you wait for so that you can engage on. And from previous works where I'd done certain social issues, I know that I'd received some criticism and some perhaps shock, and it opened the space for debate. But I'm mostly surprised at the way that Sophia has been accepted as a kind of window into, both from the inside as well, as a window into finding solutions while trying to understand the root causes in some cases of abuse, and the supports, the kind of, the impact it's had on the children, the particular sort of, there are cultural elements that come to the fore, the immense human values that I appeal to in the book, that I invoke in the book. And I think that for the most part, it's just been seen as a way of trying to find solutions. Where people come up and say, well, I can identify with the story and I want to know more. And there's something intense about getting into, especially when you're rewriting, getting into the space of the attacker and writing sometimes extremely violent, getting into putting the shoes of the attacker on and actually being that while you write. And then in the same, in a couple of weeks or in a couple of days, actually getting into the shoes of the victim and writing from that perspective takes an immense kind of shift. But I'd like to think that from the readership, there's a sense that there's some fairness in the way that both sides have been shown. And maybe not fairness, but more a sort of a collaborative exercise maybe in how the story is told from both perspectives. And that solutions can be found for the sake of the future, for the sake of the children, which is the primary motivation for writing this novel.
Okay. There's so many questions I have still left that I want to deal with, but time. So should we open it up? Yeah. So if you have any questions for the writers, please put your hand up. And I have my glasses now, so I'll be able to see. Okay. Okay.
Questions? Good.
Yeah, there we go.
Loads of questions.
Hi, good evening. Firstly, I want to congratulate all three of you as well, Shubnum, because I think you've taken a very important topic and you've used fiction as a way of being activists, if I may say so. That's my opinion. I just want to ask you, when you're writing about gender violence, do you think that fiction has the potential to impact on human psychology? Because, for example, I lent your book, Shafinaaz, to someone who I believe is in an abusive marriage. She read it, she reflected on it, she recognized herself in Zareen, the character who is abused in your novel, but she didn't really take any action after that. So can fiction be a form of self-help when it comes to the subject of gender violence, do you think? Or is it different depending on the reader and how willing they are to change their situations? Thank you very much.
Is it to both of us? Or?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm sure you both can take it.
I think it can. I think it can change. I mean, since I've written this book, I've had people write to me and say, it happened to me when I was 6, or it happened to me when I was 12, and I've never talked about it before. And I think that, and what's interesting is that all the women who were writing to me were from very similar communities that I grew up in, and so they could identify with the women, but they could also see those places as the places that they had grown up in. So I think it has a huge potential to, be like a self. Yeah. What did you? I'm sorry.
I'm just considering what you said about fiction being a kind of self-help, in that I hope it's not just meant to console a person, that I'm not the only one experiencing this, because I'm extremely traumatized by that idea. But I do think that if it creates a shift in consciousness, if not for immediacy in seeking help, but in an idea that this is actually something that makes sense. There's some reflections in here where Zareen's having reflections, and you actually can side with her or think, why isn't she taking a step ahead? I'm hoping that a person reading this who is or who can identify with the situation realizes that there are methods ahead, that you don't have to be silent about it, that there are members of the family who may actually understand, or somebody who might be able to support them in the situation. So if you say that she hasn't actually reached out for counseling, I'd say as yet, how is she managing a situation? What makes sense for her right now? Are there little children involved? Sometimes there's various variables that you need to look at. And I'm hoping that at some stage, if she discusses with you, there's a shift to do something beyond it, or to get some intervention, to organize around some intervention for the couple, or whatever the case can be. But thank you for the feedback.
And also, maybe could I just add that maybe fiction is not the answer. Let's put it that way. But it leads you on a path to maybe an answer of your own, I feel.
It can be a start.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, just a start, perhaps.
Yeah, okay. We'll take
Hi.
that. I can hear someone saying hi, but I can't.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay, right.
My question is, as they were speaking before in the previous session, who has a right of writing for who? And you are both women, you are writing fiction for women on gender violence. What do you see it as a man? How does he write about gender violence? How does he portray that picture? And obviously you'll be seen differently if a man trying to get that story coming through. What is your thoughts on that?
I think everyone has a right to write. I think everyone has a right to write about gender-based violence. Gender-based violence. I'm sorry, I can speak. I can, if they choose to. And I think once we start sort of confining it to certain spaces and saying only you can speak on gender and only you can speak on violence and only you can speak on race, then we're not getting very many different perspectives in, and maybe we're not kind of moving towards new ideas. My 2 cents.
I've interviewed on sort of both sides. Well, it's difficult to say both sides in that I don't believe that it's only men that abuse and women that are abused, but the majority of instances do show it to be that way. Having said that, I write in the point of view based on data, getting into the point of view and the mindset of the abuser, who happens to be a man in this particular novel. And in some cases, on the one hand, the abuser tends to feel as though he's correcting a situation, punishing so that he can, or disciplining so that he can rectify and correct and keep his family together. So it's interesting how that comes across. So you get a bit of point of view, as I said, written from data, from interviews in my case. So I'm not writing out of imagination in my situation. I'm not writing out of, putting myself in the wondering what if, what does the abuser think. I have collected interview material and worked together what the perpetrator actually, how he construes the situation where he's abusing. He doesn't see himself as a bad person. He sees himself as somebody who's rectifying bad behavior.
That said, I wish we would get a South African writer writing a book about, from a male perspective, about women abuse. I think that would be interesting.
It would be very interesting.
Yeah.
And to invoke one of the earlier writers in the opening when Jude said, if there's a book that hasn't been written, then you should be the one to write it.
Thank you very much. My question really is about the imaginary emancipatory possibilities about the exchange of violence. So, for instance, thinking about these victims of abuse unleashing violence. You know, Celia, a slave girl who cuts the master into pieces and sort of puts him in the fire in the morning, the master has disappeared. Or women in relationships who sort of take, you know, the witchcraft sort of, option, you know, put something in the husband's food and the husband is, all of a sudden subservient. It's a provocation that I'm trying to sort of pose to you and get your thoughts on. So you have this woman that sort of gets this violence from this man within a context of a marriage. Or in the case of Celia, she was a slave, particularly purchased for sexual sort of responsibilities. Violence, and these women choose violence as they're going to unleash violence on the husband or the master. Do you think violence in that sense has emancipatory possibilities?
So I'm just trying to get a sense of your question. Do you think violence has emancipatory possibilities? That's what you're saying? Am I correct?
Oh, it was a very colorful picture that you painted of women there. I don't know that it does. I mean, we can't choose or decide how victims should and shouldn't react to violence. I'm not sure that it has emancipatory possibilities. Do you?
Immediately a story comes to mind, and it's been made into a movie, but I can't remember the name. It's just the life story of Kiran Ahluwalia, who was married and taken across from India to live in London with her husband, and she repeatedly was abused. And the story starts off because she's in jail. She's been jailed because one day she sets her house alight with her husband asleep and burns him to the ground because she's not able to find emancipation from her situation because she's not allowed to divorce her husband. Now she's in this marriage. She has nowhere to go. She's in a country in which she doesn't speak English. She has no finances and no way of making money. And one day she just sort of throws gas around the room and burns the house down. And she's in jail, and a women's activist group gets together and they find within this jail a number of women who have murdered abusive spouses. So perhaps that answers your question.
I think with that we're going to wrap up. Time is up, so I'm sorry we can't take any more questions. I'm so sorry. Are we good for time?
One last question.
One last, can we take? Okay, sorry.
5 minutes.
My time here. Okay, we can take the one on top there.
Yeah.
Or
It's
yes.
It's here.
Okay.
Evening, everyone.
So, yeah. Okay.
Kagiso, I've been in a situation where someone said, I have to be raped because of the way I wear and stuff, and style, you know. And someone I know killed herself for being a homosexual. So how do we deal with a situation where someone says, you have to be raped because of the way you wear? Do we act up on it or change the style? How do we deal with it?
Hard. I mean, I can imagine how you feel about it. I can imagine feeling terrified. But do you change your style? I don't know. I mean, it's your choice. That's what it ends up being. It ends up being what you choose to wear, how you choose to move forward. Do you choose to talk about it? It ends up being a question of choice when it comes to that. But I don't know how you deal. Are you ask? I mean, you just said, do you change your style or go on? That's what you asked, right?
I'm saying,
how do you react on it when someone says,
I
You
have
have to
no
be raped.
idea. No idea. No clue.
okay,
Yeah.
I think the biggest violation is not being yourself. You owe it to yourself to just be you.
okay, thanks.
No, good, okay. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shafinaaz, Kagiso, and Shubnum. Thank you. You've been fabulous.